academic group, where does one talk about food? Well, you've got to start with the music first. And I just think of the example of Tchaikovsky, who was one of the greatest classicists ever. For me, he's after Beethoven and Mozart in terms of what my brain runs on, is addicted to. But he was one of the martyrs who, 150 years ago, the birth of the modern, the mid-19th century, had to obey the pressure on him and commit suicide rather than wait for them to kill him because he was gay. Okay. Although he was the greatest musician of his time. And we had the same story of Aristotle, Jesus. They martyred themselves to show people what right is about, however much you believe with what they believed in, but it's exactly the same story. They drank the Amlock, or they were crucified, or the who taught Maimonides? Who was Maimonides' greatest guru? And Maimonides is the greatest Jewish physician of all time, was the Ibn Mansur, the Wool-Gatherer, the Sufi of Babylon a century before, who, when they took him off to burn him at the stake because he kept contradicting the Ayatollahs and their closed belief system that you had to obey, he said, Lord, forgive them what they do. If I were them, I would be doing the same to this troublemaker, this bullshitter here, this whistleblower. But if they knew what I know, they wouldn't be doing this. And this is a story of martyrdom. And that's where maybe we start with the Banting story. When was William Banting's period? Mid-19th century, 1850 or so. And no doctors could help him as he passed 90 kilograms at 5 foot. And he was crippled, and he was the most successful in the family dynasty undertaker in London. They were the undertakers of the royal family for about 120 years into the century. And what saved his life was that he had some ENT problem. You know the story? He went to see a guy named William Harvey, an ENT surgeon in Harley Street. William Harvey. Now, William Harvey had been to some lectures in Paris about the milieu interieur and advanced physiology. Who's the milieu interieur? Who's the Frenchman? Whose lectures he went to? And this guy spoke about glucose metabolism and diabetes. And this sowed a seed in this very bright academic ENT surgeon's head. And when the next patient approached him with this problem, but also with his corpulence, he said, hang on, I went to this lecture, these couple of lectures in Paris recently, and he wrote down for him the beginning of the Banting diet, which isn't anything like we know it now, but they were eating so badly. They were living on liquor and flesh and lots of starch. And you know the story of what happened to Banting. He lost about 80 pounds. So he went down from 90 kilograms to 60 kilograms, and he was able to get his life back. And he then brought out, at his own expense, his family expense, on corpulence, his own description of it, and was published in the leading journals. And of course it caused uproar, but all the czars and kings and empresses of Europe followed it with huge success. So what is Banting about? What happened at the same time? Who were the two greatest brains, leaders, taught broad people of the 19th century for me? Well, I saw Jung, the interview with Carl Jung last Friday night. If only Elma had been there with me to hear it, because it was mind-boggling. Sometime we must actually tune into that New York movie and pay for it and watch it, because it's so inspiring on what Jung stood for, ethics stood for, and therapy is about. And who was the other giant leader of the 19th century, who's such an inspiration in everything we stand for? Not a medical man, but he's the founder of modern education and the founder, in a sense, of modern ethics, and founder of natural medicine. What's the Iskador, the holly?
Mistletoe.
Mistletoe, the holly, yeah, mistletoe, Rudolf Steiner. And getting to know the Steiner movement here, the anthroposophy movement here, because I wandered into everyone's health shop 10 years ago, starting to think laterally and unhappy with not being in medicine, but also unhappy about going back into medicine and beginning to think laterally. And so I got to meet Guy Ames and the crowd of anthroposophists, not just the herbal medicine nutrition pushers, but this whole philosophy of holistic medicine. And those two guys, for me, still, I battle to think of anyone else from the middle of the 19th century who made such a difference to the world in different ways, the Steiner, the Waldorf schools. And the movement is still growing. So he was alongside Kierkegaard at the same time that the great Dane, who was the founder of the modern, come on you psychologist, what is he the founder of?
Existentialism.
He was the founder of modern psychology. He was the greatest reform Protestant thinker of his time. And how did he kill himself? Because he wouldn't back off. As he said, it's tough going against the stream when everybody's going the other way happily in their monetary and comfort ways. And he railed against the venal, rich archbishop, Protestant archbishop of Copenhagen, until he dropped dead in the street one day. But I went to his gravestone, I went to his library in Copenhagen, because when the Reverend Bax lent me his book, when I heard him quote Kierkegaard 20 years ago, I realized this guy was one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century, of the last two. I mean, it was my grandfather's time, our direct link back in time. Who was Semmelweis, Ignaz Semmelweis? The Semmelweis paradox. Semmelweis was brilliant, but unfortunately Hungarian, Budapest Gynae, who did well enough to get an appointment at the very, very top of the range state Gynae hospital, Langen Hospital in Vienna, around about the middle of the 19th century. In other words, at the same time as these other guys I'm talking about. Jung came later. Okay? And at the same time that stirrings were beginning about Koch and Pasteur and Lister, but they hadn't heard about the miracle that was happening with microscopic work and microbiology. And Semmelweis inherited, he got appointed as the gynae obstetrician to one of the wards at the Lying-in hospital. And what did he find? It went on for year after year after year. The obstetrician's death rate in that ward, in the wards, was sort of 50%. Who's our gynae here? You're the gynae, right? And what did he discover?
Washing your hands.
Yes. And what triggered it was his observation that he and all his colleagues would go and do all their autopsies, because they lost half their patients, in the morning, and in the afternoon they'd proudly go to do their rounds in the lying-in ward, wearing their filthy dissection room clothes, just having wiped the scalpels off on their tunics, because this was now the fashion, and they would then go from mother to mother to mother and examine them. And what did he observe? That in the nurses' ward, where they were women, they didn't know anything about microbiology and germs. Remember, this was only 160 years ago, but they knew nothing about microbiology and germs. They had learned nothing from the Broad Street pump and the epidemics of South Africa and Europe for hundreds of years, the plagues, contagion. He noticed that in the nurses' ward, the mortality was less than 10%. And being a simple Hungarian peasant by comparison with these august Austrian aristocratic doctors, he put one and one together and he started washing his hands. They hadn't even discovered carbachol yet. They were using whatever simple disinfectant, but washing their hands between patients, because that's what the nurses did. And for a couple of years, he was able to show at the academic meetings, at the autopsy meetings, that the nurse's rate and his rate became the same. So everyone started to get the message. So what did they do with Semmelweis? What did his colleagues do? What's the Semmelweis paradox? Semmelweis paradigm. His colleagues said, no, he's crazy. A, he's crazy. B, he's destroying our reputation. So they had him locked up as a raving lunatic, and within 6 weeks they had the guards beat him to death. He was martyred. Within 3-4 years, the news started coming through, and of course he was right, because Lister and Koch and Pasteur were starting to get the same results in America and in England and in France, but Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were 20 years behind. So the Semmelweis paradox, if you look it up on Wiki, is mind-blowing. If you read Semmelweis's biographies, it's mind-blowing what he had to endure. Locked up at the prime of his life. He wasn't a diplomat like these guys. He was a firebrand with a passion. So we better all learn our lessons from whistleblowers, because it cost him his life. Do you know what's happened in America in the last 2 years because of all the exposures about, for example, the vaccine industry and the drug industry? What's the latest figure on how many whistleblowing American and Canadian doctors and chemists, top scientists, have died mysteriously, as happened in the first Clinton reign, when dozens of his associates and mates mysteriously disappeared or got wiped out because they had the dirt. So they were shut up. And that's happened now repeatedly. Haven't you heard this? Mm-hmm. How many doctors have disappeared or been murdered or been drowned or committed suicide because of whistleblowing, as the guts are starting to be ripped out of Glaxo, which unfortunately is my son's biggest customer in England. As an IT specialist, I have to shut up. I mustn't upset my son and Glaxo. They've paid the biggest fines ever, $3 billion recently, and they're going to pay even more now because of the Chinese debacle, because they were caught cheating in China. So Pfizer and Bayer are the biggest mafia in the world. And as John Le Carre wrote in, what's his famous book, The Constant Gardener, it's the story of one of these debacles, but he had to fictionalize it, where one of these drug companies pays for a giant cheap trial in Nigeria or Zimbabwe or somewhere, and they dump this antibiotic there, and a whole lot of kids get fed it, and they have absolute carnage. 5 years after he published that book, in fear of his life, like Salman Rushdie, in fear of his life, so it was fictionalized, the Nigerian or Zimbabwean governments, they finally fined Pfizer a couple of $1 billion in compensation for the damage they did. But as they say, you can't jail the big corporations, you can't jail the top companies, because they're too big to jail. You just have to swallow it. And who pays for the mistakes of the vaccine industry? What happened in 2009 with the swine flu epidemic? Where did you guys be with all this Skinner, all this rubbish? I looked at this happening and I started writing my blog, questioning and asking for evidence that Tamiflu is better than placebo. It isn't. And it's just more and more it's being damned